Hello everyone. We are going to get started. I think almost everyone has joined now. Welcome to today's webinar. We are today talking about Shift Left, integrating accessibility from the start. My name is Ivana Cabrera. I am the customer marketing lead at Venngage, and I am joined by today's hosts. So we have Eugene Woo, the CEO at Venngage, and Daryn Harpaz, the CEO and founder of Zenyth Group. We were originally going to be joined by Juliet Alexandra, but unfortunately, she had a family medical emergency, so she's not going to be able to join us today. But we are in good hands with Eugene and Daryn. Before we dive in, I just want to share a little bit about what you can expect today. So, in the next hour, we are going to explore different topics related to how to integrate accessibility earlier in your development processes. So, you will hear about the importance of digital accessibility, what different channels are covered within digital accessibility, the meaning of shifting left, and how you can make websites, applications, and documents accessible from the start. And more. I'm not gonna spoil the rest of the presentation because we do have a pretty good outline for you today. And just a quick few housekeeping notes. Please use the chat feature to submit questions throughout the presentation. We will be addressing them in a Q&A session at the end. And this webinar is being recorded. So the replay will be sent to your email addresses after the webinar, along with the presentation. So that's pretty much it. I am now going to pass it off to Eugene, who is going to start us off.
Thank you very much, Ivana. To kick things off, why digital accessibility? I'm going to go into, I think most of us are probably aware of why we need to do digital accessibility, but I'm going to go over like the three main reasons why digital accessibility is important. The first one, they're all pretty obvious, but I think the first one, may not be as obvious, and it is to increase inclusiveness of things that we take for granted every day. I think, for a lot of us, something as simple as reading online, filling out a form, using an app, we take a lot of those things for granted. But if these interfaces aren't accessible, we're excluding a fairly large portion of the population. So that's the number one reason, I would say, why we need to increase inclusiveness and why we need to adopt digital accessibility. Ivana, can you move the slide forward? And then the second one is, next slide, please. The second one is legal compliance. So accessibility is the law. And as much as I would hate to admit it, it is one of the compelling factors of digital accessibility, what compelling factors for people, why they need to essentially comply with the regulations and to adopt accessible design practices. I'm sure many of you have heard of other people, or maybe even you have been, your organizations have been sued or have had complaints from the Office of Civil Rights. I certainly have. In fact, this year, there was a new ruling from the ADA, from the Department of Justice, ADA Title II, which essentially enforces digital accessibility standards, the WCAG or WCAG standards, to most organizations that are federally funded, federal, state, and locally funded, which pretty much encompasses a wide swath of organizations. So complying with accessibility regulations is one of the compelling reasons to do digital accessibility. And then lastly, next slide. Lastly, but I would say this is probably the most important point, is that making things accessible actually creates a better user experience for everyone. I'm sure we've all heard of the examples about how how captions were first invented or were first provided as an accommodation for people with disabilities, but in fact, it's now used widely. I personally use captions whenever I watch, movies, right? So creating an accessible experience can create a better user experience for everyone. That means making websites easier to navigate, using plain language that's easier to understand, and also creating interfaces that are more simple for everyone else. So I'm going to go over a few myths around digital accessibility because we hear about it quite a fair bit, and I think for someone who's starting out in digital accessibility, it's easy to kind of get caught up. And certainly, we ourselves, we as in Venngage, we were sort of confused when we started our journey as well. And I would think the first thing we used to say is, why would we need to make our website or our tool? So we're a design tool. It's a visual design tool. Why would we need to make our website accessible, for the visually impaired? Like, we couldn't imagine, or at least weren't able to understand why that would be relevant, right? And I think that's a huge myth that that accessibility only impacts a few people. But the truth is, it has a huge, the population that we're impacting is a lot bigger than we think. So I think recent stats say that 15% of the world's population have some sort of disability. And if we add in the aging population, so this number is even bigger. So, the numbers that I have is by 2050, the number of people aged 60 and above is projected to reach over 2 billion people. So it's a huge population that are impacted by accessibility. The second myth is that it's very expensive. It's very, very costly. And I would say here that part of what we're going to share is how you can actually make this cost a lot less. And it is by shifting left. It is by adopting accessibility principles early in the journey. So Daryn and I will share a lot of practices and a lot of best tips on how you can actually make this not costly and very and cheap. The third thing we hear a lot is that accessibility hurts design and it makes things boring. So one of the complaints as a design company, one of the complaints we get a lot is, oh, does it mean I can only use a few colors? I cannot have fancy, beautiful designs. It has to be just all text. So we hear a lot of these comments when it comes to making things accessible. And I'm here to tell you that that's not true at all. I mean, we're a design company, and we make lots of designs that are both beautiful, attractive, engaging, and accessible. So it's all about using the right tools and understanding how to make your design or your documents or your website accessible. Next slide. So I'm going to hand it over now to Daryn, who's going to go over more details of what digital accessibility covers and everything else.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar presentation. Thanks for being here. Eugene, great points that you make, and I'm happy to be talking about shifting left today. So, look, I mean, what does digital accessibility cover, right? We are essentially going to talk about, traditional websites, of course, web applications, single-page applications, but across all of these, accessibility needs to be built in. This should be built in from the very beginning. So this ensures that your users can navigate via keyboard and that screen readers can correctly interpret, the content. So when we structure pages with proper headings and we use, these ARIA labels where needed, this allows assistive technology to present this information clearly. And of course, testing across multiple browsers and devices is always essential to cover a wide range of user setups. So just kind of moving on through this on the next slide, accessibility in applications spans across operating systems. These, of course, include Windows, Mac, OS, iOS, and Android. But we're talking about ensuring compatibility with screen readers such as VoiceOver and TalkBack because this is really just essential for users with vision impairments, allowing users to scale text, for example, adjust contrast settings. This enhances accessibility and usability for all users and making our apps more flexible and inclusive across these devices and platforms we're talking about. On the next slide, we're talking about, actually, I'm going to jump ahead to slide 10 to multimedia. Thank you. Multimedia content includes videos, podcasts. We see this in animations. These should all be accessible to users with disabilities. Captions essentially allow people with hearing impairments to follow along with videos. Descriptive transcripts, which you've probably all used or heard about. These offer full content access for audio and visuals for the deaf-blind. And audio descriptions provide a narrative of this visual information for users who are blind or have low vision. I often like to turn these on myself. And it's important because including these features ensures your multimedia content is essentially usable by everyone. So just to frame this up, I want to talk about that. And Eugene, let me hand it up to you. You can talk about documents, and I'll jump back in.
Thanks, Daryn. Yeah. So real quick, I happen to deal a lot with documents. I think I get this part. There are 4 key elements to a document accessibly. The most important being headings and tags. Now, essentially, we all, and why are these important, right? The way we read is we skim. Nobody, I mean, you can tell me on the chat if you do. Nobody reads word by word, left to right. We skim, and how do we skim? We're skimming headers, right? We're sort of just scrolling down with our eyes and catching like the headers, anything that's bolded and big, and then we decide whether we want to read word by word or not. So that's how everyone reads, whether you're reading with your eyes or with a screen reader, and that is why headings and tag structure is very important, because it tells the screen reader, this is a heading 1, this is a heading 2, and it allows a user using a screen reader or a different type of assistive technology to then just skim or skip or navigate through the headers, and then they can sort of jump into the content if they want to. So that's the most important thing. The rest are fairly common aspects in all types of digital content, whether it's documents, websites, or apps, and that's color contrast. You need to have sufficient color contrast so that you can see the text with a background. And I have some examples later on. Alt text, and alt text is alternative text, which essentially makes images accessible by providing text. So very similar to something like captions. And lastly is reading order. Reading order is related to text and structure. As I mentioned, if you need to have the proper reading order so that a screen reader will read your document the way you expect them to. You expect any reader to read them. Next slide. So social media. So a lot of our content now are on social media. The same advice and best practices for the multimedia stuff that the multimedia content that Daryn talked about applies, and the one that I just talked about in documents apply for social media, which means color contrast, captions. A lot of social media is video these days. It's video and images. So alt text and captions are probably the predominant, the main things one has to look for. Adding alt text to social media is still quite challenging. There's definitely auto alt text, but I wouldn't bet money on the auto-generated alt text. So if you're posting something on Instagram or Facebook, there will be alternate text generated. I would go in and edit it, and for different platforms it's different. Some platforms are harder than others. Instagram, for example, you have to go into the advanced settings, and in there you can edit it. It's like multiple steps to go into. If anybody wants more details on this, contact me later or contact us later, and we'll give you like a whole guide on social media, how to make your social media more accessible. Yeah, so I'm gonna shift back to Daryn. Go ahead.
Great, good points, Eugene. Thank you. All right, so we're shifting left. Now we're going to talk about how we make our websites and applications essentially accessible from the start. A little more technical here, but in the context of accessibility, shifting left just involves moving accessibility considerations to the earliest possible stages of a project, like design and planning, right? So this is being proactive, and this approach ensures that accessibility is not just an afterthought and helps to avoid costly rework later. We often see in our practice, building website to be accessible from the ground up, first pixel down, might only add 20 or 30% of a cost to the project. When clients come to us for complete remediation and having to identify all the defects and rebuild the platforms, could be 2 to sometimes 300% the cost of the original application. So it does make a big difference, and that's, the way that you make this cost effective is by shifting left. Look, honestly, by making accessibility part of the foundation, you create more inclusive and compliant digital product from the start. And this is really, we feel, the only way to create systems and processes that create accessibility and content, but that can do it at scale, which is really what we're talking about here. Eugene, how do you see this in terms of system shifts?
Yeah, so when I look at shifting left, oftentimes I think there's many different ways where you can start moving accessibility, to earlier in your process. And I think one of the best ways of doing it, or one of the more practical way of doing it, is what I call a system shift. And I'll explain it a little bit what system shift means. But essentially, it's a shift where you are implementing something that has something small that can have a much bigger impact. These essentially are movements at a higher level that when you implement in your organization, can make basically everything a lot easier. So if you go to the next slide, I'll show you an example of what a system shift means, as opposed to like all the other levels of shift. So a system, so when you think about making a website accessible, you can teach someone all the rules. And literally there are thousands, hundreds of rules, with the WCAG rules, I'm talking about the regulations on how can you make this, page, and everyone can learn those, everyone by themselves can learn those rules and do the testing and do everything all by themselves. However, you can also create a system in your CMS by creating an accessible template in your content management system, the CMS, and then allow everyone else to use that template to create other content. And as long as they follow the template, and this template is by default accessible, you've done all the work in it, and they're just replacing some text, they may be replacing some of the images, the text, the content, but the structure and everything is there. The heading structure is there. And all of that is there. And I can talk about a little bit more. You have some guardrails in your system. And essentially, this small shift by creating one accessible template will have a huge impact, because everything else that's created, it's no longer the Wild West where everyone can do whatever they want and publish content whatever they want. They're publishing from a few standard templates that have been created for accessibility. So that's an example of a system level shift, right? You're not just relying on people, you are implementing guardrails through your system. Next slide. So what does it look like? What does a system like this look like? So if you're creating an accessible content system, what does it look like, right? Typically, you'll need a centralized team. So, and if and obviously, if you have a centralized team, you will need buy-in from the leaders, the executives, or whatever the hierarchy in your organization. You will need some leadership buy-in, some management buy-in, because typically there is a centralized team controlling the system, whether it's the IT team, the marketing team, the accessibility team. And this is the team that provides the tools, the templates, the design systems, the components, and the guardrails that will ensure that everyone else can create accessible content easily. Typically, it also starts with them creating a process or policies. It starts with policies, processes. Sometimes branding is part of this as well, and training. But more importantly, usually all of that stuff is great. But I think the one part that I would like everyone to really think about is the tooling and the infrastructure, because that is how you can ensure a system shift to the left. So go to the next slide, and here's some examples. I can give you some real world examples. The first is in a content management system called Drupal, very popular. Drupal's, it's kind of like WordPress if you haven't heard of it, but it's very popular out there. And in this organization, it was a university, I forget which one. Whenever you update an image or you upload an image, it prompts you for the alt text. And you cannot complete the action without actually putting in the alt text. So, forgetting to put alt text is a very common thing that makes pages inaccessible. But by doing this, by putting in this guardrail, essentially this problem goes away. And very similar in Canvas. Canvas is an LMS, learning management system. They also have similar functionality. And then our design tool, Venngage, for example, has an automatic color contrast checker. So I talked a little bit about color contrast. It's very difficult and to expect someone to go out to a different page and check the color every single time they're making a color change. So by having the right tools set up, where in this case, color contrast is being checked every time you change. This is the color picker in Venngage. Every time you change a color, it tells you if it's too low of a contrast. It's done automatically. Next slide. So I just want to give a very high level practical implementation strategy, which is get buy-in from management or executive buy-in, help so that they can invest in systems that allow you to implement your policies, that will allow you to do this system shift, and then have a centralized team where this team knows about accessibility. They're the ones that will create the templates, set up the guardrails, update the processes, so that it makes it a lot easier for the whole team to shift left.
Yeah.
All right, so that's my spiel at a very high level. We're going to go in. Darren's going to take you into a little bit more detail on how to actually do a lot of actually how to make pages, web pages, and documents and everything else accessible.
Yeah, Eugene, I like what you're saying. And just to add to that, when you get the buy-in, and you can truly have accessibility as part of the fabric of an organization, the culture of an organization, it becomes pervasive, right? And it kind of moves across the teams as a almost a mission for the organization. So to get a bit more granular here, we're going to talk about design annotations early on. I like to think of this as, getting involved from the first pixel down. Shifting left with accessibility often starts with adding annotations during the design phase. So essentially, this just means making, marking up the designs like you see here in the example with, to highlight key accessibility considerations like color contrast, font size, navigation. And if we address these, we've seen time and time again, if we address these elements early, we prevent costly rework by multitudes of cost savings later on down the line. This shifting left concept is so important here because it extends to, the development phase as well. Think of committing some, design errors early on. They get baked into UI UX, they get baked into code, they get pushed through into the repository, they get pushed through to production, and now you have to undo all of that, and that can cost you 200-300% more in time, effort, and resources. So we'll discuss, we'll continue to discuss on the next slide, but we just are talking about building accessibility into your component libraries and ensuring consistent accessibility across all your UI components. So much like Eugene spoke about building in accessible templates, we look on the code level at accessible UI components that become reusable from an accessibility perspective. And we have this term about baking this into the component library from the start. So, focus management and keyboard navigation, these are just very crucial. This ensures that all users can interact with elements properly, using proper ARIA labels and roles, of course, ensures that these assistive technologies, like screen readers, can interpret the components correctly. And they just go on to create seamless user experiences for people with disabilities. So component libraries, big fan. Zenyth also is a big believer and sees a lot of benefit in training teams on accessibility. This is across design, development, and content. But really custom, these training sessions equip your team with the knowledge they need to embed accessibility into their workflows from the very beginning. I like to think of the example of accessibility as a needle and trying to move the needle on accessibility. We can do that best through knowledge transfer, through education, through training. And when we deliver these role-specific training for designers, developers, and content creators, we start to see how this becomes a shared responsibility across teams and across project life cycles. And we just love the kind of practical hands-on working with teams to help them understand and become advocates for accessibility. Next slide, please. Developers and supporting developers is also very important. We love to give guidance to, accessibility guidance to developers throughout their development life cycles and helping them understand and implement these accessibility best practices. Time and time again, we see how developers are benefiting from direct access to accessibility experts who can offer this remediation support and answer their questions in real time. We call this oversight, and this oversight really helps prevent accessibility errors from just creeping into the code and ensures that issues are caught and addressed very early on, which is directly related to and correlates specifically to this shift left concept we're talking about. On the next slide, we're talking about real-time accessibility audits, and this is essential to catching these issues in code. It's already written, it's committed, we have to find them. So the audits are a way for us to get under the hood and determine what the risk and compliance issues are. Automated tools can certainly scan for accessibility violations continuously, but they can only catch so much. They do provide some instant feedback to developers, which can reduce the chance, of course, of issues slipping through the cracks. But the audits are essential to really discovering or uncovering where all the defects are hidden. Where we tie this next into is manually inspecting the code. And this is where the team gets in and they go beyond the automated testing and they catch issues that the machine simply can't detect. And these inspections really help us focus on how well the code works with assistive technologies, such as screen readers. And this is where we really ensure that the keyboard navigation, these custom components we're talking about, are fully accessible. And then coupled with your manual views and complementing these automated tests, really give us a more thorough accessibility evaluation of the tech stack and the tech ecosystem. Just a note around testing with assistive technology or using testers with assistive technology. This is what we call real-world testing with assistive technology by using folks with disabilities to give us these insights into how truly accessible the product is. We've got tools and best practices, but nothing is ever going to replace the human component, because at the end of the day, this is about a real individual with a disability to be able to use your system. So it's always important to make sure that user testing with assistive technology from people with disabilities is part of that process. And past that, there's just a few more pieces. There's this post-implementation piece where before the project is considered complete, it's, we need to go and we have to perform a final accessibility check, and we have to verify that everything that we've identified has been addressed. This could involve a bit of rechecking some of the fixes, running some final audits, and then overall making sure that we are complying with the WCAG standards. And we consider this really the last step in ensuring the product is accessible for, and ready for all users. Beyond that, we just kind of bring in ongoing compliance monitoring. This is to ensure that the updates and the maintenance you're performing across the system, content that you're updating, nothing's slipping into the process, and in keeping with shifting left as a concept, checking and catching these issues early on, and of course, back to reducing the legal risk and any complaints post-launch. Just a brief word around, going from strategy to action. We've explored shifting left. So some of these actionable steps you can take to implement accessibility in your digital content revolve around some of the following. Of course, ensuring keyboard accessibility. Next slide, please. Keyboard accessibility is absolutely essential for users who cannot use a mouse. We need to ensure that buttons, links, forms, and any other interactive elements can be navigated using only the keyboard, and this is crucial. So developers will typically take the lead on this task by writing code, and this code supports keyboard navigation. However, designers also need to ensure that their designs account for keyboard focus, and content creators should also check that interactive content is properly labeled for accessibility. Moving on through some of these points, we also want to focus on highly visible focus indicators. These are indicators that kind of allow us to have visual cues to show where the user is on a page when they're tabbing with their keyboard or using their arrow keys. It's very important that these indicators are clearly visible on all interactive elements. So designers will often define the appearance of the focus indicator. So example, like an outline or highlight, as you can see over Explore Web Audits on the example. And developers will go in and implement the CSS or the styles that make these indicators visible. But regardless, we need to test and make sure that it's working across different devices and different browsers for consistency. Lastly, just want to mention something around the use of native HTML elements on the next slide. Native HTML elements come with built-in accessibility features, so it's best really to use them whenever possible instead of custom components if you can. So for example, something like a native button element, it already includes keyboard support and roles for screen readers. And so just by using these native HTML elements, you can reduce the need for additional coding to make it accessible. Obviously, this is primarily handled by your developers. Designers can contribute by avoiding the use of non-standard interactive elements in their designs as well. So now that we've discussed kind of some of these foundational steps for making websites and applications accessible, it's important to note that the same principles here, of course, as Eugene has mentioned, apply to documents as well. So whether you're working on PDFs, presentations, or reports, the recommendations Eugene will be covering are just as relevant for both websites and applications as well. With that in mind, Eugene, let me hand it back to you, and you can walk us through how we can ensure that our digital content remains accessible across the board.
Sure. Thanks, Daryn. Yeah, I think all of what I'm going to talk about applies to all types of content, whether it's a document or a web page, or even a mobile app. And I talked a little bit about why tags and heading structures are important, and this is a little bit more detailed. So essentially, if you're not familiar with headings, it's the H1 and the H2, in a document, if you create a document or on a website, that kind of dictates what the titles and the subtitles are. So those have to be, properly tagged and structured, not just taking any text and making it really large, making the font really large. And then that technically it's not a header. It just looks like a header if you can see it. But a screen reader wouldn't know it's a header unless it's been tagged as a header. So that's that is the key, the key practice that everyone should have when they're creating text documents. And the same applies for texts that are in tables and other types of, when you look into charts and all of that. Just remember to always have the tags or the headers. I use those interchangeably. They're the same thing, whether it's an H1 and H2 and H3 or a paragraph. Remember to tag those. And most tools will have a way for you to tag the elements, your text elements, right? And then the last point there is about reading structure. Now, not all tools have the ability for you to actually dictate or change the logical reading order. Unfortunately, it is a tooling problem. Venngage does allow you to change or edit the logical reading order of your documents. So, and if you are unable to do it, that's where remediation comes in, but that's a whole different topic where you'll have to use Adobe and then like essentially reorder. I'm going to go into that. So next slide, please. So that is the first thing. The second thing, is again about, I said I would go into details about color contrast, and I'll show you an example. So this is an example of good and bad color contrast. Hopefully it's obvious. So if you can read the word bad in most of these squares, let me know on the chat, because you've got, I would say, really good really good eyesight, because I can see maybe the one that's yellow and green, but the other two is like, I cannot tell. Essentially, these are like pretty bad examples of, well, there's one good example, but the rest are pretty bad example of bad color contrast, right? And hopefully it's clear that color contrast and actually text size matters if you want something to be legible. There are standards around what the color contrast ratio is. I mean, you don't really need to know the number, as I mentioned. Some tools like Venngage will tell you what the color contrast is, or you can use an outside tool and check the color contrast ratio yourself. Next slide. Next one is alt text. So this is a very interesting topic. We've talked about alt text in several, so I'm not going to repeat what we've said, but there are some best practices. So I think the one very common mistake most people make is they start the alt text with something like, this is an image of, which is redundant. So anything that's redundant, you don't have to start the alt text with, this is an image of or an image of. Just go and describe the image. So the guidance that I like to tell people is, you want to ensure that the text conveys the same information a sighted user would gain from the visual. So that also means that you can add your subjective opinions in the alt text when it's appropriate. Now, a lot of people are afraid to put their own subjectivity into an alt text. But if I were to ask you to describe an image, I was like, hey, let's say you went to the Maldives, describe this image to me. You will use subject. You're not going to say, oh yeah, there's a beach and there's a whale on the beach. You will say, oh my gosh, there's a beautiful whale. It's blue and it's got like these things on its body. You will be very subjective, and so don't be afraid to actually put your own opinions and subjectivity when it's relevant, right? And there's many examples of when that's relevant. For example, there's an example, I think in the New York Times, where the image description of an actor at the Oscars, in the red carpet, like it goes into the details of how certain actors are dressed in certain trends, and they talk about things that are fairly subjective, not just the color of what their clothes are, but also all the commentary around that. Right. So next slide, please. Yeah. And so after you've done all that comes the testing. How do you actually test your document or your page? Typically, you use a screen reader, right? The manual. So I'm talking about manual testing, not automated testing. In manual testing, you would use a screen reader. There's two very popular ones. There's actually a few others as well. So NVIDIA is one of them, and JAWS is one of them. I also use VoiceOver because I'm an Apple or a Mac user. So it's very easy to turn on and just use VoiceOver to navigate your document or your web page, so that you can kind of experience, this is how someone using those assistive technology will read your page or will navigate the page. Same thing with keyboard. A lot of people do navigate your page with a keyboard, and that's also very easy to test. You're essentially just tabbing and using the arrow keys and a few other keys to go through your document. Next slide. So what kind of tools? What kind of tools should you use to create accessible documents? So this is specific to documents. There are essentially three, I would say, different types of documents, three levels of documents, right? When you talk about it, one is so these are documents that are either printed or they're in PDF form. So we're talking about digital. So let's forget about being printed. So we're talking about mainly documents that get exported as a PDF or Word file or something like that. So they are what I call the first category are these very automated transactional type documents, like bank statements, invoices, receipts, things like that. Like if notices, announcements, things that are sent to like thousands and thousands of people that are mainly automated and transactional. So there's a set of tools to make those type of documents accessible. They're mainly a hybrid of automated, templatized, accessible document tools. And there's a lot of vendors out there. For example, Equinox, CDP, PDF Fix. There's a whole bunch of them out there. If you want some recommendations, come ask me later on. I will. We know a few vendors there. The other one, on the other extreme, are these very simple plain text documents. And I would argue a lot of times, if they're plain text, you probably can get away with a web, by just posting something on the web. But if it has to be a document, you can use plugins from Grackle, and that's a Google Docs plugin. If you're using Google Docs, the whole Google Suite, Grackle is a very good plugin that can ensure that your document is accessible. And then the last category of documents would be what I call the designed layouts or visually complex documents. So these would be things like posters, flyers. It could also be a presentation or something like a report, a multi-page report. You would use a design tool. So there's lots of design tools out there, and the one that is the most accessible would be a simple to use design tool accessible is something like Venngage. So if you have needs to do that, Venngage is the tool that will allow you to create these documents easily and export them in a accessible PDF format or a HTML accessible HTML format. Right. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that gives you a high overview of how to make your documents and web page accessible in the different tools. I'm going to hand it back to Daryn to sort of wrap up this whole section.
Thanks, Eugene. And yeah, that's a reason why we're partnering on this is because we basically tested the entire marketplace and discovered that Venngage was essentially the most accessible tool for visually complex document creation. So good job on that. There is a business case for accessibility. Of course, we want to talk about, the benefit of investing in accessibility and how it drives revenues and reduces legal risks and enhances your brand reputation. But essentially, this is about creating a more inclusive digital experience for all of your users. And we're going to talk a little bit about revenue growth through accessibility. I just, before we wrap this up, my last couple of points here is just about talking about when you make your products accessible, you are catering, I should say, to a very large market. There's over 1 billion people worldwide with a disability. This does not include the aging population. I think the recent stat I read was, for the first time in history, we're about to see more people over the age of, I believe it was 70, than under the age of 14. So we're a very aging population. And at the intersection of aging and disability, there's significant revenue opportunities, and accessibility caters to both of those use cases. We know that when users find it easy to interact with your product, they're more likely to convert into paying customers, and simply seeing that accessibility drives inclusive growth. On the next slide, we're talking about, this from the perspective of improving customer retention. Customers stick with brands that prioritize their needs. I know I certainly am loyal to brands that prioritize my needs. When accessibility is built into your digital products, you're not just accommodating, of course, people with disabilities, you're creating a better experience for everyone. We look at metrics like churn rates and customer satisfaction and see there's a direct correlation to improving these metrics when users can engage without barriers. And this overall just drives higher retention and brand loyalty. On the next slide, we just talk slightly about the efficiency in the sales process. And if an accessible product or an accessible service helps users just get through into and out your product offering quicker, reducing the time it takes to move through the sales funnel. So this basically translates to shorter sales cycles, quicker deal closures, and really just less friction for your team. Metrics like lead conversion rates and customer acquisition costs show how accessibility overall boosts sales efficiency. We certainly see that here at Zenyth as well. and heading on to my last slide, this is obviously where this conversation originally started in the industry and where it's at right now. There's a legal risk that just cannot be ignored, and there's costs associated with that. The legal landscape for accessibility is ever evolving with lawsuits on the rise. We are talking about being proactive. We're talking about accessibility at the conversation of protecting you from legal risks and costly settlements. We're talking about implementing accessibility early, and this is the shift left concept, and thoroughly to ensure compliance with the ADA and WCAG standards, and just preventing these disruptive legal challenges down the road. We have seen that I think it's 35% of Fortune 500s have been sued more than twice, which should never be happening. Unfortunately, organizations come to us after a suit or two, and so this is all talking about how to get away from that traditional, overly litigious plaintiff kind of landscape that's happening in our space right now. Eugene, I think you might have a little bit talk about brand differentiation and then have a conclusion for us.
Yeah, so I think the last part about the business case of accessibility is you can differentiate with accessibility, and I'll give you two examples. One very big one, which is Apple. So if you're not aware, Apple is very much a pioneer in accessibility. Every single I would say every single product that they release or they sell have very thoughtful consideration for accessibility and inclusiveness. Everything they do, including, an example is the iPhone has voiceover. It has a lot of accessibility features in there. The new Vision Pro has accessibility features in there, and it actually creates a competitive advantage. It obviously puts themselves, they have a reputation for being a company that cares about inclusiveness and accessibility. It obviously expands their market. And they are, one of the drivers of innovation. They keep innovating on accessible features. The new iPhone with the smart features, once it integrates makes their accessibility features a lot better with their new. I'm not gonna sell their product, but I'm just saying it does differentiate their brand from let's say Samsung or a Google phone. And then the small example is Venngage. So we are in the same marketplace with Canva. A lot of you probably heard of Canva, and they're not very accessible. The stuff that they produce requires a lot of remediation, and we're a much smaller company. And we're able to put our brand out there and differentiate in the market because we are accessible, and we do talk to users with disabilities. We have created a product, that allows them to use it and allows them to read the content and consume the content that are produced from our tool. So that's the other example that I think we are that, and I can really talk about it because we are seeing the difference. Our brand is being put out there right now because we've made our product accessible. And then so just to conclude, right? Just to next slide, just to kind of wrap everything up. Prioritizing accessibility, yes, it's about we talked a little bit about compliance and about protecting legal protection, but I think the most important thing really is that it is, there's a lot of business use cases around it, like, that we just talked about. But at the end of the day, right, it is about being inclusive. It is, about doing the right thing and also, benefiting, but with the outcome of benefiting not just your company or your organization, but a lot of other people. So if it isn't obvious by now, and if you don't have or if you're starting out early in this journey, I think there is a lot of material that we just presented, and a lot of things that can help you get your organization on the right track to start to shift left. And with that, I think we have a few offers for attendees in this webinar. From the Venngage side, we're offering a free scan of your site for documents. And so we'll handle all the document scans, and we'll audit it, and we'll give you a report on where you stand right now. And then on the Zenyth side, Daryn, do you want to kind of share what you are offering to our attendees?
Yeah, if anybody's interested in an assessment, audit scan of your site to understand what accessibility issues might exist, we also provide you with a best practice documentation for the things that you could potentially fix yourself in-house, some of the low-hanging fruit, color contrast, alt text, those kind of things, give you a good push in the right direction. If anybody wants to chat about accessibility or has any questions or wants any more resources, we love to talk shop, so happy to provide those complimentary services to you. Ivana, I'm not sure if you have any questions. If not, we can...
Yeah, I don't see any
Yeah,
questions in the
yeah.
chat.
Does anybody have any questions? We can kind of answer them right now. If not, I think, yeah, it's great having everyone. I really appreciate all your time.
And we can send out a copy of the presentation to the attendees.
Yes,
Yep.
we will.
I think
We'll
yeah,
sell the
we will.
record. We're selling the recording and the presentation as well.
Wonderful.
Cool.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Felix.
everyone. Yeah, have a good weekend. Yeah, thanks for coming by.
Thanks,
Really
everyone.
appreciate everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.